The sound arrived before the weapon. July 19th, 1941, near Orsha, Belarus. A Wehrmacht artillery company dug into positions along the railroad, their field guns gleaming under summer light. Oberst Friedrich Müller checked his watch. 1400 hours. The Soviet lines sat 3 kilometers distant, silent as graves. Then the sky screamed. Not the whistle of artillery shells they knew, not the drone of Stukas they commanded, but something else entirely, a shriek that seemed to tear the air itself, multiplying, overlapping, building into a chorus of mechanical fury. 16 trails of smoke rose from a hidden position in the tree line, arcing upward like fingers of fire reaching toward heaven. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The first rockets struck before Müller could shout a warning. Not precision strikes, but a carpet of destruction that walked across their position in 7 seconds. 7 seconds that felt like the end of geometry, the death of predictable warfare. Explosions bloomed in perfect chaos, earth fountaining skyward, guns twisted like wire, men scattered like seeds. When silence returned, 43 seconds after the first shriek, Müller stood in a crater that hadn't existed a minute before. His ears rang with a frequency that would haunt him for decades. Around him, the carefully positioned battery lay in ruin, not from surgical strikes, but from saturation, from abundance weaponized. A young lieutenant, face blackened with soot, whispered hoarsely, "Herr Oberst, what was that?" Müller stared at the dissipating smoke trails, still visible against the summer blue, and said words that would be repeated in 1,000 German reports over the next 4 years. That was not artillery. That was mathematics made into terror. The Germans called it Stalin's organ because of the sound, those parallel tubes mounted on the back of a simple truck, singing their hymn of destruction. But the official Soviet designation was BM-13, Boyevaya Mashina, combat vehicle, mounting M13 rocket projectiles. The Katyusha, a nickname borrowed from a popular wartime song, a girl's name that belied the weapon's brutal efficiency. What Müller and his men had experienced was not new technology. Rockets had existed for centuries. The Chinese had launched fire arrows in the 1300s. The British had used Congreve rockets against Napoleon. Even the Germans themselves had experimented with rocket artillery in the previous war. But the Katyusha was different. It was not innovation, but industrialization. Not a wonder weapon, but a system. The launcher itself was almost insultingly simple. 16 rails mounted on the bed of a ZIS-5 truck, a common Soviet cargo vehicle produced in the tens of thousands. No complex hydraulics, no advanced targeting systems, no precision engineering that required trained specialists. Just steel rails angled at 45 degrees, wired to a basic electrical firing mechanism that could launch all 16 rockets in 7 to 10 seconds. Each M13 rocket carried 22 kilograms of explosive in its warhead. Simple steel casing, solid fuel propellant, stabilizing fins at the rear. Accuracy, terrible by artillery standards, with dispersal patterns that could spread across hundreds of meters. But accuracy was never the point. The mathematics were brutal and elegant. One battery of 4 Katyusha launchers could deliver 64 rockets in under 10 seconds, raining down nearly 1.5 metric tons of high explosive across an area the size of a football field. A single Guards mortar regiment, the official designation for Katyusha units, contained 36 launchers organized into 3 battalions. Do the arithmetic: 144 rockets, over 3 tons of explosives, delivered in the time it took a man to run 50 meters. Then, before counter-battery fire could even be calculated, the trucks would vanish, driving away at 60 kilometers per hour on roads barely worthy of the name. Traditional German artillery doctrine demanded precision. Each Krupp field gun was a masterwork of engineering, accurate to within meters at maximum range. Gun crews trained for months to achieve optimal firing solutions. Each shell was logged, each target carefully selected. Artillery was chess, a game of calculated moves. The Katyusha played a different game entirely. It didn't aim, it saturated. It didn't calculate, it overwhelmed. It was a weapon designed not for the individual target, but for the concept of area denial itself. In his first report, filed 3 days after the Orsha attack, Müller wrote with a precision that masked his horror. Enemy has deployed multiple rocket launcher system of unknown configuration. Effect is not tactical but psychological. Recommend immediate investigation and countermeasure development. But even as he wrote those words, Müller understood something that German High Command would take months to accept. The countermeasure to abundance was more abundance. And in the summer of 1941, as Operation Barbarossa drove deep into Soviet territory, the Wehrmacht possessed many advantages. Abundance was not among them. The weapon that would come to symbolize Soviet industrial warfare had been born from necessity and improvisation. In the 1930s, Soviet engineers had experimented with various rocket designs, building on work begun in the previous decade. Georgy Lanamak and his team at the Reactive Scientific Research Institute developed solid-fuel rockets capable of military application, but it was Andrei Kostakov who refined the design into something producible at scale, and it was the collective Soviet engineering apparatus, that vast network of factories, institutes, and desperate innovation that transformed a prototype into a flood. The first Katyushas rolled off production lines in June 1941, mere weeks before the German invasion. Initial production was limited, experimental. The Soviet military establishment, still reeling from Stalin's purges that had decimated experienced officers, approached the weapon with institutional caution. Then Barbarossa began, and caution became a luxury the Soviet Union could no longer afford. By July, as Müller's battery learned the sound of the future, Soviet factories were already retooling for mass production. The beauty of the Katyusha's design was its simplicity. No component required advanced metallurgy. The trucks were already in production. The rockets themselves could be manufactured in facilities that had previously produced agricultural equipment. Within months, Katyusha production exceeded 1,000 launchers. By the end of 1942, over 3,000 were in service. The weapon scaled not because it was sophisticated, but because it wasn't. German intelligence, meticulous as always, compiled detailed reports. They measured the rocket dimensions, analyzed fragments from unexploded ordnance, calculated fuel composition. They understood every component, but understanding and countering were different propositions. The Wehrmacht possessed its own rocket systems. The Nebelwerfer, smoke thrower, fired rockets from fixed positions with greater accuracy than the Katyusha. German engineering was superior in almost every technical metric. But the Nebelwerfer required specialized production, trained crews, careful positioning. It was a precision instrument in a war that increasingly demanded blunt force. Müller, promoted to battalion commander by autumn 1941, encountered Katyushas 17 more times before winter. Each encounter followed the same pattern: the shriek, the saturation, the silence. His men learned to dig deeper, to spread their positions wider, to fear the sound more than the shells themselves. In October, near Bryansk, his battalion captured an abandoned Katyusha launcher. It sat in a muddy clearing, 3 of its rails bent, the truck's engine cold but intact. Müller ordered it brought to the rear for examination. The engineering officer who dismantled it, Hauptmann Klaus Richter, filed a report that read like an insult. Construction quality, poor. Welding, adequate at best. Targeting mechanism, primitive. Electrical system, basic beyond description. Overall assessment, effective. Carried the weight of an entire philosophy. The Katyusha was not beautiful. It was not elegant. It represented everything German engineering culture had been trained to dismiss. Crude workmanship, inaccurate delivery, wasteful expenditure of munitions. And yet, it worked. More than worked, it terrified. Richter included in his report a calculation that Müller found himself reading repeatedly. Based on observed, production, simplicity, and available Soviet industrial capacity, enemy could potentially produce these systems at a rate exceeding our ability to neutralize them through conventional counter-battery operations. The translation was stark. They could make them faster than we can destroy them. Winter brought temporary respite. The Katyushas fell silent, not from German countermeasures, but from mud and snow that immobilized even Soviet trucks. The Wehrmacht, freezing in positions never meant for static warfare, found dark humor in the silence. At least Stalin's organ had frozen too. But in the spring of 1942, when the thaw came, the sound returned. Louder now, more frequent. The Soviets had learned through that brutal first winter, had refined their tactics. Katyusha units no longer fired from static positions but employed shoot and scoot tactics with ruthless efficiency. A battery would roll into position, fire its entire load in under a minute, then vanish before German. Artillery could even plot coordinates. Soviet doctrine emphasized this mobility above all else. Better to fire inaccurately and survive than to aim perfectly and die. Müller's division encountered a new pattern near Kharkov in May. Multiple batteries firing in sequence from different positions, creating overlapping barrages that walked across German lines like a storm with intelligence behind it. The effect was not just destructive but disorienting. Soldiers lost sense of where attacks would come from when the next shriek would tear the air. One young corporal, Werner Scholz, kept a diary that was later recovered from the Kharkov battlefield. His entry from May 23rd read, "We can hear them singing at night, not the Russians, the rockets. Even in silence, we hear them. Müller says it is just memory, but I think the sound has entered our blood." The psychological impact of the Katyusha became a subject of study for Wehrmacht medical officers. Soldiers exhibited symptoms, consistent with artillery shock, but with distinct characteristics. The anticipation of the sound, the brief warning before saturation, created a specific form of anxiety that traditional bombardment did not. German doctrine emphasized the individual soldier's ability to seek cover, to react to incoming fire. But against Katyushas, there was no reaction time. By the time you heard them, they were already arriving. Summer 1942 brought the great offensives towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus. The Katyushas followed, embedded in Soviet defensive lines, firing from the rubble of destroyed cities, from forests, from positions that changed hourly. German intelligence estimated Soviet rocket launcher strength at over 5,000 systems by August. The number was conservative. Actual deployment exceeded 8,000 launchers, with production facilities evacuated eastward beyond the Urals, churning out both launchers and rockets at rates that defied German economic analysis. How could a nation supposedly crippled by invasion, with millions of casualties and vast territories occupied, still produce weapons at such volume? The answer lay in something Müller would not fully understand until much later. The Soviet system had been designed from its inception for exactly this kind of warfare. Total mobilization was not an emergency measure but the default state. Every factory could be retooled. Every worker was already considered part of the war machine. The distinction between civilian and military production was semantic. When the Germans captured Soviet factories, they found production lines that could switch from tractors to tank parts within days. The same industrial logic applied to Katyushas. A facility making truck chassis would add rail mounting equipment. A factory producing agricultural rockets for weather modification would shift to military warheads. The entire economy was a weapon, and the Katyusha was simply one manifestation of its firing. By autumn, Müller's battalion had been reduced through attrition to half strength. Not from direct assaults, though those came regularly, but from the cumulative weight of continuous bombardment. Men broke not in single moments of courage tested, but through the grinding erosion of waiting for the next shriek. He wrote in his personal journal, never meant for official reports, "We face not an army but a factory that has learned to march. Every destroyed launcher is replaced by 3 more. Every kilometre we advance costs us material we cannot replace, while they simply produce more." This is not war as we understood it. This is accountancy written in fire. The entries stopped in November 1942. Müller's battalion was encircled at Stalingrad, where Katyushas would help write the final chapter of German Eastern ambitions. But before that frozen hell, there were still lessons to be learned, truths to be excavated from the rubble of doctrine. The sound of Stalin's organ would echo long after its last notes were played, a hymn to industrial warfare that changed how nations understood the relationship between production and destruction. The winter of 1942 descended on Stalingrad like a judgment. By November, the city had become a graveyard of ambitions, where German Sixth Army found itself trapped not by brilliant Soviet maneuvering alone, but by the same mathematics that had haunted Friedrich Müller since Orsha. The encirclement closed on November 23rd. Within days, Katyusha batteries ringed the pocket, positioned on the frozen steppe like sentinels of a new age. They no longer needed to hide. The Germans had nowhere to run. Müller, now commanding what remained of his artillery battalion, 3 functioning guns and 72 starving men, and watched from a ruined factory as Soviet rocket batteries established firing positions in plain sight, 2 kilometers distant. They worked methodically, almost casually, unloading rockets from supply trucks, mounting them on the rails, checking electrical connections. His own ammunition supply had dwindled to 14 shells, 14 shots to last until relief that would never come. Meanwhile, he counted 16 Katyusha launchers being prepared, 256 rockets that would be fired, reloaded, and fired again. The arithmetic was no longer military calculation. It was epitaph. The first barrage came at dawn on November 27th, not aimed at military targets specifically, but at the concept of German presence itself. The rockets fell across supply depots, field hospitals, command posts, and empty streets with equal indifference. Saturation bombardment designed not to destroy specific objectives, but to make existence itself unsustainable. Hauptmann Klaus Richter, the engineering officer who had once dismissed the Katyusha as crude, sat beside Müller in a basement that had once been a schoolroom. Children's drawings still clung to one wall, faded beneath. Soot and frost. "Do you remember my report?" Richter asked quietly. "When we captured that first launcher?" Müller nodded. "I was wrong," Richter continued. "I called it effective. But effectiveness implies meeting a standard. This." He gestured toward the ceiling as another barrage screamed overhead. "This creates the standard. We measure warfare by their rhythm now." The siege dragged through December. Luftwaffe supply drops became increasingly desperate and futile. What good were scattered supplies when Katyusha fire could destroy landing zones faster than aircraft could arrive? The Soviets had learned to time their barrages with the sound of approaching transport planes, turning supply runs into predictable target practice. On Christmas Eve, as temperatures dropped below -30 degrees Celsius, Müller's position received its final artillery shell. A single round for a gun that could no longer traverse properly, manned by crew too weak to load efficiently. He ordered it, fired not at the Soviet lines, but at nothing, into empty sky. A gesture, a prayer, a farewell to doctrine. That same night, the Katyushas sang their carol, wave after wave, batteries firing in rotation to maintain continuous pressure. The sound had become so constant that silence itself seemed unnatural, a void more terrifying than the screaming. Private Werner Schultz, the young corporal who had written about hearing rockets in his blood, no longer kept his diary. The last entry, dated December 20th, read simply, "We do not fear death, we fear that we never understood what we were fighting." By January 1943, Soviet forces had tightened the noose. Katyusha units advanced to within 1 kilometer of German positions, close enough that their crews could see the hollow faces of starving soldiers. The psychological warfare was complete. The Germans could watch their destruction being prepared, could count the rockets being loaded, could do nothing but wait. Müller survived Stalingrad. He was among the 91,000 captured when Sixth Army surrendered on February 2nd. As Soviet soldiers marched him past a Katyusha battery, he stopped, compelled by some need he couldn't articulate. The launcher sat quiet now, its work done, rails empty, truck engine cold. A young Soviet lieutenant, no older than 25, stood beside it, smoking a cigarette. "May I?" Müller asked in broken Russian, gesturing toward the launcher. The lieutenant shrugged, nodded. Müller approached the vehicle as if approaching an altar. He ran his hand along the rails, feeling the residue of rocket exhaust, the crude welding that had somehow proved more durable than German precision. Up close, the weapon was even more unimpressive than the one they'd captured 18 months earlier. Rust stains, bent metal, electrical wiring exposed and frayed. "How many?" he asked. "How many did you fire?" The lieutenant thought for a moment. "This launcher? Maybe 400. Rockets. My battery? 3,000, maybe more. We stopped counting. 400 rockets from one crude truck. Müller's entire battalion had fired fewer shells in 6 months of combat. The disparity wasn't tactical, it was philosophical. Why does it work? Müller asked, more to himself than the Soviet officer. But the lieutenant answered anyway. Because it doesn't need to work perfectly. It just needs to work enough, over and over, until the enemy has nothing left. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The prisoner columns marched east, into captivity that would last years for those who survived. Müller walked among thousands of ghosts, men who had believed in tactical brilliance, in quality over quantity, in the superiority of German engineering. They had been defeated by a truck with 16 tubes welded to its bed. In the spring of 1943, Müller found himself in a prison camp near Tomsk, Siberia. The camp held over 2,000 German officers and specialists, men whose expertise the Soviets hoped to exploit for reconstruction. Among them were engineers, factory managers, logistics officers, all the infrastructure of modern warfare. The camp commander, a Colonel Petrov who spoke fluent German, organized work details at a nearby factory. Not a military facility, but a civilian plant that produced agricultural equipment. Müller was assigned to a maintenance crew, repairing conveyor systems and production machinery. One morning in May, he noticed something familiar about the assembly line configuration, the spacing of workstations, the flow of materials, the emphasis on rapid production over individual craftsmanship. It was the same logic he'd seen in the captured Katyusha. During a break, he asked the factory supervisor, a woman named Svetlana Ivanova who had managed the facility since 1941, "Did this factory produce weapons during the war?" She smiled slightly. "This factory produced whatever was needed. Tractors in peacetime, rocket rails in war, tractors again now. The machines don't care. The workers know how to adapt." The revelation settled over Müller like cold water. The Katyusha wasn't a weapon system. It was a symptom of an entire civilization organized around the principle of rapid reconfiguration. Every factory was potentially a weapons plant. Every worker was potentially a munitions producer. The distinction between war and peace was simply a matter of which blueprint was being followed today. He thought of German industry, specialized and compartmentalized. Krupp made artillery. Messerschmitt made aircraft. Each facility required specific tools, specific expertise, specific supply chains. Efficiency through specialization. But specialization, he now understood, was also fragility. Bomb one Krupp factory and German artillery production suffered for months. The Soviets could lose 10 factories and simply shift production to 20 others. That evening, Müller wrote a letter that would never be sent, addressed to no one in particular, perhaps to history itself. "We lost because we built cathedrals while they built forges. We perfected the individual weapon while they perfected the system that made weapons. A Panzer tank was a masterwork, irreplaceable. A Katyusha was a Tuesday's production. They buried us not in quality, but in the simple mathematics of replacement. For every one of our weapons destroyed, they made 10 more. For every soldier we killed, their factories trained 20 replacements. We fought with art. They fought with arithmetic, and arithmetic never grows tired. By 1944, some German prisoners were being used as technical consultants, their expertise valued even by their captors. Müller found himself reviewing Soviet industrial reports, translating technical documents, occasionally offering suggestions that were politely ignored. He learned that total Katyusha production by war's end would exceed 10,000 launches. The rockets themselves numbered in the millions. The entire program, from research to deployment, had cost less than Germany spent on a single prototype heavy tank. One document he translated detailed the post-war plans for rocket development. The Katyusha was being phased out, replaced by more sophisticated systems with better range and accuracy. But the underlying philosophy remained: design for mass production first, performance second. Klaus Richter, the engineering officer, was housed in the same camp. The two men spent evenings discussing what they'd learned, trying to extract meaning from defeat. "We were taught," Richter said one night, "that German engineering represented the pinnacle of industrial achievement: precision, quality, excellence in every component." "And we were right," Müller replied. "A German artillery piece was superior to any Soviet equivalent, but irrelevant," Richter finished. "Because they didn't need the best gun. They needed enough guns. The Katyusha taught them that good enough, produced in vast numbers, defeats perfect produced in limited quantities." The conversation turned to what awaited them after repatriation, whenever that might come. Germany lay in ruins, its industrial base destroyed, its population traumatized. How would a nation that had prided itself on quality rebuild in a world that now valued quantity? "Maybe," Müller suggested quietly, "we learn to build differently, to value reliability over perfection, to accept that the best system is the one that can be replicated, not the one that achieves ideal performance." Richter laughed bitterly. "You're suggesting we become more Soviet? I'm suggesting we understand why they won." The years in captivity dragged on. 1945 brought news of Germany's final collapse, of devastation beyond comprehension. 1946 brought the first, repatriations, though Müller and Richter were retained for their technical knowledge. 1947 passed in the limbo of defeated expertise, valuable enough to preserve but not trusted enough to release. It was not until October 1948 that Müller finally returned to Germany. The train journey west took 11 days, crossing landscapes still scarred by war, through cities that existed only as rubble-marked maps. He arrived in Hamburg to find his family's home reduced to foundation stones. His wife and daughter had survived, evacuated to the countryside. His son had died at Kursk in 1943, killed by, the letter had said, enemy artillery bombardment. Müller never asked what kind of artillery. He knew the sound. Reconstruction consumed the next decade. Müller found work as a technical advisor for a machinery firm, helping design production systems that prioritized efficiency over elegance. The Marshall Plan dollars flowed in, American abundance, rebuilding European capacity. The irony was not lost on him. He noticed how the new Germany, rising from ashes, incorporated lessons from both defeat and occupation. Standardization replaced bespoke engineering in many sectors. Production lines emphasized rapid output. The Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, was built partly on accepting that perfect was the enemy of good enough. In 1955, Müller attended a technical conference in Munich about modern manufacturing methods. One presentation discussed Soviet industrial practices, delivered with the careful neutrality required in Cold War academia. The speaker described the Katyusha program as an example of integrated industrial mobilization. During the question period, Müller stood. "I encountered these weapons during the war," he said carefully. "What struck me was not their sophistication but their inevitability. Once you understood the system that produced them, you understood that defeat was not a possibility, but a mathematical certainty." The room fell silent. Speaking positively of Soviet methods remained controversial, but an older man in the back, a professor from Stuttgart, nodded slowly. Perhaps that is the real lesson, not about weapons, but about systems. The nation that can mobilize its entire productive capacity, that can turn every factory into a potential arsenal, that nation cannot be defeated by purely military means. Müller sat down, the old memories flooding back, the shriek of incoming rockets, the sight of crude welding on captured launchers, the mathematics of replacement written in fire and steel. Klaus Richter had returned to Germany 2 years earlier. He now worked for an automotive firm in Wolfsburg, helping design production systems for civilian vehicles. The two men met occasionally, drawn together by shared understanding of lessons learned in defeat. Over coffee, in a Munich cafe in 1957, Richter pulled out a newspaper clipping. It showed Soviet rockets on display in Moscow's Red Square, larger and more sophisticated than the Katyushas, but clearly descended from the same philosophy. "They're still building them," Richter observed, "but now everyone else is too. The Americans, the British, even the French. The Katyusha showed the world that rockets could be produced industrially, not as wonder weapons, but as ordinary munitions." Müller studied the photograph. "We thought we were fighting a backward nation. Instead, we encountered the future. And learned from it, eventually, slowly, at terrible cost." The conversation drifted to the present, to the new Germany rising from defeat, to the technological competition between East and West. But always, the shadow of that first barrage near Orsha lingered, the moment when the old certainties shattered under salvos of crude but effective fire. By 1960, Müller had retired from active work. He spent his remaining years gardening, reading, and occasionally writing about his wartime experiences, though he never published. The notes accumulated in folders, technical observations mixed with philosophical reflections. One passage, written in 1962, summarized his understanding. The Katyusha was never about the rocket itself. It was about the relationship between industrial capacity and military power. We Germans believed that superior engineering would overcome superior numbers. We were correct about our engineering superiority. We were wrong about everything else. The Soviets understood that modern warfare is not won by the best weapon, but by the most weapons. Quality reaches a threshold of adequacy, beyond which quantity becomes the only variable that matters. They built to that threshold and no further, then multiplied production by orders of magnitude we couldn't match. This was not primitive thinking. It was sophisticated understanding of industrial warfare's true mathematics. Friedrich Müller died in 1968, age 63, of heart failure. His daughter, sorting through his papers, found the folders of war memoirs. She considered publishing them, but ultimately decided against it. The wounds were still too fresh, the lessons too uncomfortable. But she kept one page, framed it, hung it in her study. It was from his final letter, written the day before his death. "I hear them still, those rockets, not in nightmares, but in memory. The sound taught me that the future belongs not to those who build perfect machines, but to those who build adequate machines in limitless numbers. This is not celebration of Soviet victory. It is recognition of a truth that transcends ideology. Industrial capacity, properly mobilized, defeats martial excellence. We fought with honor and lost to production. There is no shame in this, only lesson." The Katyusha entered military legend not as a single weapon, but as a concept. By the 1970s, every major military possessed multiple rocket launcher systems, all descendants of that crude ZIS-5 truck with 16 rails. The Americans built the M270 MLRS. The Chinese developed the Type 63. The British created their own variants. But the original Katyusha, preserved in museums from Moscow to Beijing, stood as testament to a moment when warfare fundamentally changed, when individual excellence yielded to systemic abundance, when craftsmanship bowed to production capacity. When 7 seconds of fire could deliver more explosives than hours of careful artillery work, The German soldiers who heard Stalin's organ learned a lesson their nation had forgotten. That modern war is won not on battlefields alone, but in factories, on production lines, in the unglamorous work of making enough rather than making perfect. The shriek of those rockets echoed across decades, a sound that announced the death of heroic warfare and the birth of industrial warfare's true age. The Katyusha killed thousands of German soldiers, but it defeated an entire philosophy. In the final analysis, the weapon that terrified the Wehrmacht was simply a mirror, reflecting their own assumptions back at them. Distorted by Soviet industrial logic, they saw crude construction and assumed inferiority. They saw poor accuracy and assumed ineffectiveness. They saw mass production and assumed desperation. They were wrong on every count. The Katyusha was not desperate improvisation. It was deliberate design, not a failure to achieve precision, but a choice to prioritize volume. Not evidence of technological backwardness, but sophisticated understanding of industrial warfare's true requirements. The 16 rails that fired in 7 seconds represented more than explosive delivery. They represented a civilization that had learned to weaponize its entire productive capacity, that understood systems trumped components, that grasped the mathematical reality of modern conflict. Germany produced the world's finest tanks, the most accurate artillery, the most advanced aircraft, and lost to a nation that produced enough trucks with enough rails, launching enough rockets to make excellence irrelevant. That is the story of the Katyusha, not the tale of a weapon, but the chronicle of a philosophy. Not an account of Soviet genius, but a record of German learning, painful and comprehensive, extracted from the arithmetic of defeat. The sound of Stalin's organ still echoes in military doctrine worldwide. Every multiple rocket launcher system traces its lineage to those first batteries near Orsha. Every military that prioritizes rapid-fire saturation over precision strikes implements lessons first taught by crude Soviet engineering. And somewhere in the archives of military history, Friedrich Müller's words wait for readers who understand that the greatest victories are won not by those who fight best, but by those who can keep fighting longest, supplied by factories that never sleep, armed with weapons that need only be good enough, multiplied by industrial capacity that transforms adequacy into overwhelming force. The Katyusha's legacy is not its kill count or its tactical impact. Its legacy is the understanding that modern warfare belongs to nations that can mobilize completely, produce continuously, and accept that perfect is the enemy of sufficient when sufficient can be manufactured by the millions. 7 seconds to fire 16 rockets. 7 seconds that changed how the world understood power. 7 seconds that taught the Wehrmacht, and through them the world, that the real weapon was never the launcher on the truck, but the factory that made the truck. The system that deployed the truck, the nation that could lose 1,000 trucks and build 2,000 more. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.